The sterile corridors of Houston Methodist Hospital buzzed with the usual weekday morning activity. Nurses hurried past with charts in hand, doctors conferred in hushed tones, and patients waited anxiously for their turn to be seen. Among them sat Olivia Wood, a 32-year-old African-American woman, her fingers nervously tapping against her knee as she waited for her name to be called. Olivia had been trying to conceive for the past year, and this routine checkup was supposed to be another step in that journey. Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday morning would shatter her world and set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. As she sat in the waiting room, Olivia's mind wandered to thoughts of her husband, Derek. They had been married for 5 years, and from the outside, their life seemed picture-perfect. Derek was a successful real estate developer, and Olivia worked as a high school English teacher. They lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs of Houston, and their friends often remarked on how well they complemented each other. But beneath the surface, there were cracks in their relationship that Olivia had been trying to ignore. Derek's long hours at work, his frequent business trips, and the growing emotional distance between them had been weighing on her mind. She had hoped that having a baby would bring them closer together, reignite the spark that had begun to fade. "Olivia Wood?" a nurse called out, snapping her back to reality. Olivia stood up, smoothing down her floral dress, and followed the nurse to the examination room. As they walked, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that had been hidden for far too long. Dr. Angela Chen, Olivia's gynecologist, greeted her with a warm smile as she entered the examination room. "Good morning, Olivia. How are you feeling today?" Olivia managed a small smile in return. "I'm doing okay, Dr. Chen. Just a little nervous, I guess." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "That's perfectly normal. We'll do some routine tests today and see where we stand. Have you been following the ovulation tracking method we discussed last time?" As Olivia answered the doctor's questions and went through the examination, her mind kept drifting to Derek. She wondered if he was thinking about her, if he was as invested in this process as she was. The doubt that had been gnawing at her grew stronger with each passing minute. After the examination, Dr. Chen prescribed some additional tests. "I'd like you to go down to the lab on the second floor for some blood work," she explained. "The results should be ready in a few days, and we'll discuss our next steps then." Olivia thanked the doctor and made her way to the elevator. As the doors opened on the second floor, she stepped out, her eyes scanning the signs for directions to the lab. That's when she saw them. A woman, probably in her late 20s, was standing near the reception desk holding the hand of a young boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Under normal circumstances, Olivia might have simply walked past them without a second glance. But something made her stop in her tracks. The boy looked familiar, eerily familiar. His warm brown skin, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose. It was like looking at a miniature version of Derek. Olivia felt her heart begin to race as her eyes darted between the child and his mother. The woman was beautiful, with smooth, dark skin and long braids cascading down her back. She was dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, a stark contrast to Olivia's more formal attire. As Olivia watched, frozen in place, the woman leaned down to speak to the boy. "Caleb, honey, we'll be done soon. Then we can go get that ice cream I promised you." Caleb. The name echoed in Olivia's mind. She had always liked that name. In fact, she and Derek had once discussed it as a potential name for their future child. Before she could stop herself, Olivia found herself walking towards the pair. Her legs seemed to move of their own accord, propelled by a force she couldn't understand or control. "Excuse me," she heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and unfamiliar to her own ears. The woman looked up, curiosity and a hint of wariness in her eyes. "Yes?" she replied, instinctively pulling Caleb closer to her side. Olivia swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help but notice your son. He's adorable." The woman's face softened slightly. "Thank you. This is Caleb." "Caleb," Olivia repeated, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. "That's a lovely name. I hope you don't mind me asking, but is your last name Wood, by any chance?" The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, it is. How did you know that?" Olivia felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the reception desk to steady herself. I think I might know your husband. Derek Wood?" The woman's expression changed from surprise to confusion. "Yes, Derek is my husband. Do you work with him?" The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs as if she'd been punched in the stomach. The room began to spin, voices around her becoming muffled and distant. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman's voice sounded concerned now, but Olivia could barely hear her over the roaring in her ears. I'm... Olivia tried to speak, but no words would come. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the worried face of the woman, the other Mrs. Wood, reaching out to catch her as she fell. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room were the first thing Olivia saw when she opened her eyes. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then, like a tidal wave, the memories came crashing back. The woman, the child, Derek's child. A sob escaped her lips before she could stop it, drawing the attention of a nurse who had been checking her vitals. "Mrs. Wood? You're awake. How are you feeling?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle and concerned. Olivia couldn't bring herself to answer. How was she feeling? Betrayed, shattered. Like her entire world had just been turned upside down and shaken until everything she thought she knew had fallen apart. "I'll get the doctor," the nurse said, patting Olivia's hand before leaving the room. Left alone, Olivia's mind raced. How long had Derek been living this double life? How many lies had he told her? Every business trip, every late night at the office. Had they all been excuses to spend time with his other family? The door opened, and a doctor entered, followed closely by the nurse. "Mrs. Wood, I'm Dr. Patel. You gave us quite a scare there. Can you tell me what happened before you fainted?" Olivia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she explain the earth-shattering revelation she had just experienced? How could she put into words the way her heart had been ripped from her chest and stomped on? "It's all right," Dr. Patel said, misinterpreting her silence. "You had a sudden drop in blood pressure, which caused you to faint. Have you been under any stress lately?" A hysterical laugh bubbled up in Olivia's throat. "Stress? That didn't even begin to cover it." I need to go home," Olivia managed to say, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. Dr. Patel frowned. "I'd like to keep you for observation for a few more hours, just to be safe." "No," Olivia said, more forcefully this time. "I need to go home. Now." The doctor looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Olivia's eyes must have convinced him otherwise. "All right, but I strongly advise against driving yourself. Is there someone who can pick you up?" Olivia thought about calling Derek, and the idea made her feel physically ill. "I'll call a cab," she said. As she signed the discharge papers with shaking hands, Olivia's mind was already racing ahead. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to her. The cab ride home was a blur. Olivia stared out the window, unseeing, as the familiar streets of Houston passed by. Her phone buzzed several times, probably Derek, wondering where she was, but she ignored it. When the cab pulled up in front of their house, the house they had chosen together, the house where they had planned to raise their family, Olivia felt a surge of anger so powerful it almost took her breath away. She paid the driver and walked up the path to the front door. Her key turned in the lock, and she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The house was quiet. Derek's car wasn't in the driveway, so he was probably still at work. Good. She needed time to think, to plan what she was going to say when he came home. Olivia moved through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now seemed alien to her. The framed photos on the wall, had they all been lies? The gifts Derek had given her over the years, had they been bribes to keep her complacent? To stop her from asking too many questions? In the kitchen, her eyes fell on the knife block on the counter. Without thinking, she pulled out the largest knife, its blade glinting in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. She wasn't sure what she intended to do with it. Part of her wanted to destroy everything in sight, to slash at the curtains and the furniture until the outside of their home matched the wreckage of her inner world. The sound of a key in the lock made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, then Derek's voice. "Olivia! Are you home? The hospital called me and said you had some kind of episode. I've been trying to reach you all day." Olivia gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles turning white. She turned to face the kitchen doorway just as Derek appeared. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Derek's eyes widened as he took in the scene. Olivia, pale and disheveled, clutching a knife in her trembling hand. "Liv?" he said cautiously, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "What's going on? Are you okay?" The concern in his voice, the familiar nickname, it was all too much. Olivia felt something inside her snap. "Am I okay?" she repeated, her voice rising hysterically. "Am I okay? How dare you ask me that? You lying, cheating bastard!" Derek's face was drained of color. "Olivia, whatever you think is happening, I can explain." "Explain!" Olivia laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Explain how you have another wife, another child? How long have you been living this double life, Derek? How long have you been lying to me?" Derek took a step forward, his hands still raised. "Olivia, please, put down the knife. We can talk about this." "Talk?" Olivia spat. "Like you talked to me about your other family? Like you talked to me every time you said you were working late or going on a business trip? Was that all lies, Derek? Was anything you ever told me true?" She could see the moment Derek realized there was no way out of this. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." Something inside Olivia broke at those words. With a cry of rage and pain, she lunged forward, the knife flashing in her hand. Derek's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as the blade sank into his abdomen. He stumbled backward, his hands going to the wound as blood began to seep through his shirt. "Olivia," he gasped, sliding down the wall to the floor. "Why?" Olivia stood over him, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand. She watched as the life drained from his eyes, feeling nothing but a cold, empty numbness. As the reality of what she had done began to sink in, Olivia dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden, terrible silence of the house. She sank to her knees beside Derek's body, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. In the space of a single day, her entire world had been destroyed, and she had become a murderer. As if in a trance, Olivia reached for her phone. With shaking fingers, she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Olivia's voice was calm, detached, as if she were reporting a minor traffic accident rather than a homicide. I need to report a murder, she said. I've killed my husband. The next few hours passed in a blur for Olivia. She vaguely remembered the arrival of the police, the flash of cameras as crime scene technicians documented the kitchen. She answered their questions in a monotone, her mind still struggling to process the enormity of what had happened. As she was led out of the house in handcuffs, Olivia caught sight of her neighbors watching from their lawns, their faces a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. She wondered idly what they would say about her now. The quiet English teacher who kept to herself, who always smiled and waved as she left for work each morning, now a murderer. At the police station, Olivia was fingerprinted and photographed. She stared blankly at the camera, barely recognizing the woman in the mugshot as herself. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. Was this really her? Was this what betrayal and murder did to a person? In the interrogation room, Detective Alicia Ramirez sat across from Olivia, her dark eyes studying her carefully. Mrs. Wood, she began, her voice professional but not unkind. I need you to tell me exactly what happened today. Olivia took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. I went to the hospital this morning for a checkup. We've been trying to have a baby. She let out a bitter laugh. Isn't that ironic? I was there trying to start a family with my husband, and instead, I found out he already had one. Detective Ramirez leaned forward slightly. What do you mean, Mrs. Wood? Olivia closed her eyes, the scene in the hospital playing out in her mind once again. I saw them. His other wife, his son. They were there at the hospital. The boy? He looked just like Derek. She opened her eyes, meeting the detective's gaze. I confronted her. She confirmed it. Derek was her husband, too. And then, I don't remember much after that. I fainted, I think. Detective Ramirez nodded, making notes. And what happened when you got home? Olivia's voice became flat, emotionless. I waited for him. When he came home, I confronted him. He tried to explain, but I couldn't listen. I was so angry, so hurt. I picked up the knife. And then she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The reality of what she had done was starting to sink in, and Olivia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Mrs. Wood, Detective Ramirez said gently, I know this is difficult, but I need you to be very clear. Are you saying that you stabbed your husband? Olivia nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Yes, she whispered. I killed him. As Detective Ramirez continued to question her, Olivia felt as if she were watching the scene from outside her body. She answered mechanically, recounting the events of the day with a detachment that surprised even her. When the detective finally left the room, Olivia was left alone with her thoughts. The gravity of her situation began to sink in. She had taken a life. Derek's life. Despite his betrayal, despite the pain he had caused her, she had never truly wanted him dead. What would happen to her now? Would she go to prison? And what about Derek's other family? The woman and the little boy she had seen at the hospital. How would they cope with this tragedy? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Olivia felt a deep, overwhelming sense of regret wash over her. In a single moment of blind rage, she had destroyed not just one life, but many, her own included. It's like he was living two completely separate lives, Detective Chen remarked as they pored over financial records and cell phone logs in their office. He managed to keep everything so compartmentalized. It's almost impressive, in a twisted way. Detective Ramirez nodded grimly. And neither woman had any idea. He must have been an incredibly skilled liar. Their investigation revealed that Derek had met his second wife, Tanya, 5 years ago at a real estate conference in Dallas. He had presented himself as a single man, and their whirlwind romance had quickly led to marriage and the birth of their son, Caleb. Tanya, when interviewed by the detectives, was as shocked and devastated as Olivia had been. "I can't believe he would do this to us," she sobbed, clutching a confused and frightened Caleb to her chest. "How could he lie to me for so long? How could he lie to his son?" The detectives also spoke to Derek's colleagues and friends, many of whom expressed disbelief at the double life he had been leading. Derek was always so devoted to Olivia, his business partner, Michael Taylor, told them. "I never would have suspected. I mean, sure, he worked late sometimes, took a lot of business trips. But in our line of work, that's not unusual. I never thought—" As they built their case, Detectives Ramirez and Chen couldn't help but feel a mix of sympathy and frustration towards Olivia. While they understood the depth of her pain and betrayal, the brutality of her response was hard to reconcile with the quiet, intelligent woman described by her friends and colleagues. "She just snapped," Olivia's best friend and fellow teacher, Samantha Davis, told them tearfully. "Olivia's not a violent person. She's kind, patient. She loved Derek so much. Finding out about his other family, it must have destroyed her." Meanwhile, Olivia remained in custody, her bail denied due to the severity of the crime. Her lawyer, a public defender named Eric Gonzalez, worked tirelessly to build her defense. "We're going to argue for a charge of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder," Gonzalez explained to Olivia during one of their meetings. "Given the circumstances, we have a strong case for arguing that this was a crime of passion, committed in the heat of the moment without premeditation." As the investigation progressed, the detectives uncovered more details about Derek's double life. Bank records showed regular transfers to an account in Tanya's name. His cell phone contained 2 separate contact lists, carefully managing to keep his 2 lives separate. He even maintained 2 separate social media profiles, each presenting a carefully curated image of a happily married man. "He must have been under incredible stress," Detective Chen mused. "Living like this, constantly having to remember which lie he told to whom, always at risk of being discovered. It's no wonder he was able to keep it up for so long. He probably didn't dare slip up even once." Detective Ramirez nodded. "And now, 3 lives are destroyed. 4, if you count the child. All because one man couldn't be honest." As they prepared to hand their findings over to the district attorney's office, both detectives felt a sense of sadness. There were no winners in this case, no justice that could truly right the wrongs that had been done. All they could do was present the facts and hope that the legal system would find a way to address the complex tangle of betrayal, heartbreak, and violence that had led to this tragedy. The Harris County Courthouse buzzed with activity on the morning of Olivia Wood's trial. Journalists jostled for position outside, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman whose story had captivated the nation. Inside, the tension was palpable as lawyers made their final preparations and the jury filed into the courtroom. As the trial began, the prosecution painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and rage who had lashed out violently when confronted with her husband's infidelity. They emphasized the brutality of the crime, the fact that Olivia had chosen to arm herself with a knife before confronting Derek. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor Sarah Martinez said in her opening statement, "this is a case of premeditated murder. Mrs. Wood didn't just happen to have a knife in her hand when her husband came home. She waited for him, weapon in hand, with the intention of confronting him and, ultimately, killing him." Olivia Wood is not a murderer, Gonzalez argued passionately. She is a victim of a profound and devastating betrayal. In a moment of extreme emotional distress, she acted in a way that was completely out of character. This was not a premeditated act, but a tragedy born of heartbreak and despair. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Colleagues described Olivia as a dedicated teacher, kind and patient with her students. Friends spoke of her devotion to Derek, her excitement about starting a family with him. One of the most powerful moments came when Tanya, Derek's other wife, testified. She spoke haltingly, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, about the life she had shared with Derek and their son Caleb. "I loved him," Tanya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he loved me. I thought we were happy. I never suspected, never dreamed." She broke down then, unable to continue. As she was led from the witness stand, her eyes met Olivia's for a brief moment. In that look was a shared pain, a mutual understanding of the depth of Derek's betrayal. Throughout the trial, Olivia remained largely silent, speaking only when directly addressed by the judge or her lawyer. But when it came time for her to take the stand, she found her voice. "I never meant to kill him," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "When I saw him that day, when I confronted him about what I'd learned, I was so angry, so hurt. It was like everything I thought I knew about my life, about our life together, was a lie." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I picked up the knife because I felt so powerless. I wanted him to feel as scared, as vulnerable as I did at that moment. But I never truly wanted him dead. When I realized what I'd done, I couldn't believe it. I still can't." As Olivia spoke, the courtroom was silent, every person hanging on her words. Even Sarah Martinez, the prosecutor who had argued so vehemently for Olivia's guilt, seemed moved by her testimony. In his closing argument, Eric Gonzalez emphasized once again the extreme circumstances that had led to Derek's death. "This is not a case of a cold-blooded killer," he told the jury. "This is the case of a woman pushed beyond her limits, who acted in a moment of extreme emotional distress. Olivia Wood has already lost everything: her husband, her home, her future. I ask you not to take her freedom as well." Sarah Martinez, in her rebuttal, reminded the jury of the seriousness of the charge. "Regardless of the circumstances, a man is dead," she said. "Olivia Wood made a choice to pick up that knife, a choice to use it. That choice has consequences." As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, Olivia sat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Whatever the outcome, she knew that her life would never be the same. The woman she had been, the happy, hopeful Olivia who had gone to the hospital that fateful day, was gone forever. Inside the jury room, 12 men and women grappled with the complex issues at the heart of the case. Was Olivia's act one of premeditated murder or a crime of passion? How much weight should they give to the extreme emotional circumstances that led to Derek's death? When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Olivia stood, her legs shaking slightly, as the foreman handed the verdict to the judge. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Olivia Wood, not guilty. A collective gasp went up from the gallery. Olivia swayed on her feet, steadied by Eric Gonzalez's hand on her arm. But the foreman wasn't finished. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of voices. Olivia stood still, shock evident on her face. She had avoided a murder conviction, but she was still facing years in prison. As the judge called for order, Olivia turned to look at the gallery. Her eyes found Tanya, who sat with Caleb on her lap. The two women looked at each other for a long moment, a world of unspoken understanding passing between them. In the days that followed, as Olivia awaited her sentencing, the case continued to be a topic of national discussion. It sparked debates about infidelity, about the nature of betrayal, about the limits of human endurance in the face of emotional trauma. When the day of sentencing arrived, Judge Elaine Foster addressed Olivia directly. "Mrs. Wood, this court recognizes the extreme circumstances that led to your actions. It acknowledges the deep betrayal you suffered and the emotional distress you were under at the time of Mr. Wood's death. However, we cannot ignore the fact that a life was taken. The law demands accountability." Judge Foster paused, her eyes meeting Olivia's. "It is the sentence of this court that you be committed to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for a term of 7 years." As Olivia was led from the courtroom, a sense of finality settled over the proceedings. The trial was over, but its impact would be felt for years to come. The sterile corridors of Houston,